Good evening, good evening, good evening. Well, this is a good beginning. Good evening, testing. Testing, testing, testing.
Try it.
Testing? Ooh,
Yeah.
okay.
There we go.
Michael, you just needed to stand up. Yeah. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming tonight on this very, very beautiful evening where we have a whiff of springtime, finally. My name is Lisa Yui, and I'm the producer of Art Life, Changing the World Through the Arts. Some of you may know me primarily as a pianist, an educator, and a lecturer, and a concert organizer. As a pianist and a faculty at several music conservatories, I have spent a very large percentage of my life in practice rooms and among musicians. And I created this series because as an educator, I wanted to remind myself and my students the role the arts play within the world, not only within conservatory walls or within or on the stage or in a gallery. The arts help people imagine the world as it can be, how different it could be from it is right now. The arts are used in some really amazing creative work by people in a variety of fields. At our last event, we had a robotics engineer, we had a hypnotherapist, and we had a disabilities activist. Tonight, we have three presenters, Dr. Michael Alcee, who is a clinical psychologist and a mental health coordinator at Manhattan School of Music. We have Michael Hafftka, who is a figurative expressionist painter. We have Tereza Lee, who is a pianist and an immigrants' rights activist. And my hope is for you to all hear their stories and hear about their work and to see how the arts have changed them and the world around them. Before I forget, I really would like to give my deep, deep thanks to Yamaha Artist Services, who have provided this beautiful space. I have an incredibly long relationship with them. There's a picture from when I was 10, intensely playing at a Yamaha piano, and for supplying this beautiful refreshments as well. So tonight we'll begin with Dr. Michael Alcee, who is a clinical psychologist, a two-time TEDx speaker, and a frequent podcast guest. He specializes in using his background in music, literature, and the arts to help individuals, groups, and organizations make creative connections for transformative growth and development. Michael very recently was awarded first prize in the American Psychological Association's Schillinger Memorial Essay Award contest for his essay on the connection between psychoanalysis and jazz improvisation. In tonight's presentation, Michael will discuss the connections between understanding music and how to read changes we encounter in life on a daily basis. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Michael Alcee.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Lisa, for curating this wonderful evening. I'm excited to talk to you about music, art, literature. I first wanted to start off with a little bit of my background. Even though I'm a psychologist, since I was a boy, my mother was a social worker who loved literature. And when I was a kid, we used to read together, and the characters became our friends and companions. So whether we talked about The Glass Menagerie or Othello or any literature, the idea was that art was always supposed to connect with life, not to be separate from it. And one of the things that is no longer an academic issue for me, because I work with artists every day doing counseling, is to talk about what is the connection between art and life. So many of us seem to divorce them or put them separately. In fact, there's a apocryphal story of Franz Kafka, the great writer, who said that he didn't want to go to psychoanalysis because he was worried that therapy would actually take away his muse, even if it would exorcise his demons. And there's been a long-standing concern amongst artists that perhaps working on our private and personal lives will take away the creative fuel that we need to have the edge to create powerful literature, music, and art. But it turns out, I think this is actually a misconception, that it turns out that if we get to know ourselves more intimately, psychologically, there is an art in that. And in that artful process, we can live more artfully, and we can enliven the very art that we produce. But of course, what's that misconception that we start with? Is the idea of the tortured artist, the doomed genius, right? The Sylvia Plaths, the Robert Schumans, all of those folks that we know that really, died penniless and tortured. But this has been with us since the Renaissance. I think we might be able to look at it a bit differently and say that what sets artists apart is that they are still able to look at with sensitivity at the nuance and range and subtlety of what's inside of us, and to find new forms to express that. And of course, when you're sensitive to that kind of nuance, you're aware that the world is heartbreakingly beautiful. So, my idea, instead of wrestling with Kafka, I think of the biblical story of Jacob. And in the story, Jacob wrestles with the angel. And by wrestling with the angel, he struggles, and as he struggles, he gets a blessing. So I think one of the tasks of art is to wrestle and struggle to get that blessing. And I should probably talk a little bit personally about my connection to music. Since I was a kid, I studied music, and when I was in high school, I studied with Abraham Sternklar, who was wonderful. He was amazing. He was a Juilliard-trained concert pianist. And I remember when I first met him, I was struck, because even though he was masterful, he played all the Chopin etudes at age 15, I think that he told me. And he was so smart in terms of theory and expression, but he was also so down to earth and warm and connected in a way that I never thought an artist could be. And from him I saw that you didn't have to sacrifice being an integrated person in order to be a fully fledged artist. Fast forward to college, I start taking some jazz lessons. And I can remember my jazz teacher named Andy Jaffe, and one day I chanced upon him in the practice room, and he was playing this beautiful song, and he was playing this beautiful lick, and I said, "Andy, aren't you gonna write that down? Aren't you afraid that you're gonna forget it?" And he said, "No, if I forget it, that's okay, another good idea will come along." And what I learned from him is that there's this wonderful idea that we have to be constantly open and improvisational in this dynamic process that is not only music, but it's life. So how do I connect this to psychology, right? How does music connect to psychology? I think music actually shows us how we're built, and I want to just play for you a few little tunes to show you. And by the way, keep in mind I'm an amateur musician, but I have a beautiful piano. Music demonstrates something crucial about the psyche, that we start actually as many, and then we become one. We actually start in a polyphonic mode, and then we become monophonic music. So let's start with polyphonic music, right? Just a little taste, okay?
Yes.
Shall we? Yes. All right, hopefully Mr. Sternklar is looking down on me. You hear the different voices coming in, each one entering. It turns out that that's the way the psyche is built too. We think that we are one, but it turns out Pablo Neruda, the poet, was right. We are actually many. In his famous poem, he says, "Of the many men I am whom we are, I cannot settle on a single one." So, psychologically speaking, one of the reasons why often so many people feel confused, anxious, depressed, you name the mental health issue, it's often because they don't know how the psyche works. They haven't studied psychological polyphony. But we are more familiar with, obviously, the other kind. So let me play you a little snippet of this, which probably you all know. Accustomed to when we think of our psychology. One major melody, one major voice, with a conductor, everything's orderly and it's beautiful. But it's not how it works in practice, right? Aren't there times when some of us feel like, I feel sad and yet I feel angry? Or I feel hopeful and yet I feel scared, right? All operating on the same time. So let me give you an analogy. This is what I tell my students when they come into therapy for me, and I say, listen, this is a really cheesy analogy. It's like we have a table before us and we're asking all the different sides of you to come to the table to have a conversation. And we're curious which side talks the most, which side talks the least, and which sides aren't even invited or allowed at the table. That's what the psyche actually looks like. If you want to think of it in musical terms, because I think there's a lot of musicians in the house, it's like an orchestra. And we're curious about each instrument as a different part of us. And when we play an instrument, we should know its range. We should know what it's capable of. And we shouldn't expect it to do something that it's not intended for. Does this make sense? And so, one of the important lessons that I found is that doing psychotherapy is actually learning how to help people read the changes of how they shift from one self-state to another, from one moment to the next. And to be curious about that. How many of you drive an automatic car? Some drive a stick shift, right? For those of you who drive an automatic, it automatically shifts the gears without having to worry about it. You don't even have to think about it. The psyche works like that. We shift effortlessly, seamlessly most of the time, until we run into trouble. But it turns out it's an illusion that they're not gears. And the psyche works like that. And I like to also think of it like a jazz combo. That each side of us is like a little jazz piece, and we're trying to learn how to work with some of those changes and do something new and interesting. Should I show you a little jazz, maybe, to give you a taste?
Yes.
Because reading the changes comes from a jazz artist's capacity to notice the harmonic changes that are going on in time and space, and to figure out how to do something interesting with them. So I'm going to play you two songs. I'll play you a piece of, let me play you, all right, I got it. So this one's called You Are Too Beautiful. Which is The Nearness of You. We actually learn how to embrace the dissonances. We actually learn to court the dissonances and try to find new and interesting forms to work with. Right? You see that in some of the piece. Now let me show you the other piece, which is You Are Too Beautiful. Now sometimes people come in with a psychological issue and they only play it in one sort of way. And one of the things we want to do is help them to mix it up. Because even in something sort of longing and plaintive, there also can be something swinging. Ready for it? So the lyrics are, You are too beautiful, my dear, to be true, and I am a fool for beauty. Right? So McCoy Tyner takes this piece and he goes, the same chords, even the same melody, and mix it up. And the point is that if you think about that, that's what we do psychologically. Maybe I should give you an example of that, psychologically, how we do that. How do we move back and forth between these different states, right? Let's see. So when people come into a session with me, I listen to them as if they're coming to me with their certain kind of blues, right? Because most people don't come to me to celebrate everything's going well. They usually tell me, you know what, my boyfriend's broke up with me, I really don't know if music is meant for me, and my dog just died, and it's a country song. So usually when I'm trying to listen to their blues, I'm trying to listen to what is really aching, but I'm also listening to the melody that they don't even realize that they're playing. And the challenge of being a psychotherapist is like being a conductor without a score. That's why most people don't like to do it. Because it's terrifying, initially. Because you have to actually listen closer to the harmony and melody that is rather invisible even to us. So, a client comes into me, I've been called by her RA saying that they're very worried about her because she's cutting. She cuts herself regularly, and she's actually quite proud of this. And she doesn't feel bad about it, and in fact her friends have confronted her on it, and she says, no, this is what I do, and it's my business, leave me alone. And they say, oh, you're gonna see her, Mike, today. I'm like, oh great, this is gonna be fun. And initially, when I start to see her, I'm thinking, uh-oh, this is going to be difficult. She sounds like she's got something very severe going on. And I listen to her as she talks, and you know what she begins to tell me? She says, well, first of all, I don't know what people are making such a big deal out of this. Second of all, I've been in counseling before, and no counselor really has understood me, and you probably won't either. In fact, other counselors said that I needed more help, and I should be going to a hospital. Initially, I thought, uh-oh, maybe she's right. But then as I listened to her story, she told me about her family, I found out a little bit more of the harmonic architecture of her life. And when I listened to the chords, I found that she came from a family where she was the oldest of several children, and she was expected to take care of her younger siblings. And her mother was so overworked, and her father both were overworked, that she was expected to carry everything. And when she was upset, well, they couldn't deal with it because it made them even more stressed. And in fact, when they would get stressed by her getting upset, they would leave the house. So what I learned is that the harmonic environment was such that she could not open up into this story comfortably, right? It wasn't just that she was aggressive, but that there was an instrument or instruments that hadn't been played. Now, what instruments might you ask? She came in and she was rather aggressive, but I realized that some of the softer, tender instruments weren't being played. There was no plaintive violin being played. Until I leaned in and said to her, you know, I can understand why you've been hurt by other therapists before. It sounds like they really weren't listening to how much pain you've been in. And it sounds like in your family, people haven't been listening to your pain too. I wonder if we can make a bit more room for it together. I got the most dumbfounded look. She was completely surprised, because all of a sudden I heard different harmonies that she knew were there, but she never quite put into words, quite put into form. And once we did, we could take the melody and start to reharmonize it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So, the idea of this whole therapy business, actually, is to help us to become more creative internally, in terms of recognizing and shifting between these different states of self, like different instruments or different members of the jazz band, and becoming more interested in nuanced ways of trying new chord progressions out, trying new harmonizations, trying new melodies, and also there's a playfulness that's involved. So let me give you another case that I had just yesterday. You ready? I will sort of disguise it so nobody knows who it is. But I had a student come in, they were talking to me about how they really didn't like music as much as they thought they did. I know, that's surprising from in high school music, isn't it? A lot of people have crises of faith when they're in conservatory, right? There's so much riding on this thing that you're doing. And this person said to me that they really weren't sure if music was for them, but they knew they were very good at it, and they liked that very much. And as we started to talk, I became playful with them, and I said, you know what? I think you have had an arranged marriage with music for a long time. And I wonder if we could talk about how that marriage is going. And I also wonder, in the beginning, I think this arranged marriage was very appealing to you. And she said, actually, that's a really good point. I was very appreciative that music helped me get out of my home country. I am really happy to be in this wonderful city. I am really excited about the diversity of experiences I've had because I like to travel. But music itself, no, I'm not so interested in him. So I said, let's talk about him. And let's talk about this marriage. You notice how what we do is we find some of the melody and then we start reharmonizing it. We start opening it up. And by the way, as you musicians know, one of the beautiful things about music is that it is both a left and right brain pursuit. Music is one of the most highly analytical kind of arts there is because it's math in motion. And yet, to be expressive, you have to surrender and allow your dreamlike right brain to help you bring things together. And actually, it turns out it's no different when we think of psychotherapy, which is also, it's no different when we think of creative living. So, when I think of psychotherapy, I think of the art of reading changes because I think of the art of allowing us to both be analytical and to dream at the same time. You might recall, Leonardo da Vinci has this wonderful drawing of a Vitruvian man, arms outstretched like this, and there's a circle and a square surrounding him. I think the metaphor of that actually is that the square is the square of logic and reason, and the circle is the funny circular thing that we call emotion. And when we can somehow fit those together, we reach something divine. And I think that's the pursuit of what art does, and I think that's also the pursuit of what learning how to read the changes from the inside out does for us. My hope is that what it does is it allows us to listen to all of the different instruments. And instead of trying to play an orchestra piece for you myself, I'd like to just end with this, one of my favorite movements from Rachmaninoff's Symphony in E minor. And this piece actually showcases the kind of work that I did with this girl who was cutting. And what you'll hear is different instruments coming in representing different sides of self, saying a melody with a different tone and a different feeling. And that is how it illustrates how we are not only one, but many. And when we can allow those processes to work together, that they produce something transcendent. So, let me play this, but it looks like someone's calling me.
Take the call.
I'm gonna take the call.
Put it to the microphone.
Put it to the microphone? Hold on, let me get to my spot. Technical difficulties. Okay, here we go. So you notice how each one comes in its own independent way and yet adds to the mix. That's what I believe the psyche is, and that's why I feel there's no distinction between art and life. There never really was meant to be. And so what's lovely is as musicians, if we can kind of tune into the inner changes as well as the outer changes, what more interesting music we can all make. Thanks.
Thank you so so much, Michael. It's a very moving and accurate depiction of the connection between music making and our inner spirit. And it really, at times, I think many musicians and music lovers are aware that music has a way of expressing ourselves in a way that words really are unable to do so. But I've never really heard anyone quite create that analogy so eloquently as you did. So thank you so much. Our next speaker is another Michael Hafftka. Michael is a figurative expressionist artist whose works are in permanent collections of numerous museums, as you can see in his profile. I love to tell the story of how we met. We met at a cemetery, and this is a true story. As a student, I got a gig through Manhattan School of Music to perform at the Steinway Mausoleum in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn during Museum Week, and I was asked to perform a concert atop this hill by the Steinway Mausoleum. And Michael was visiting that day, and that was a great example of how life and death collided, and also an example of how art truly connects people. Tonight, Michael will discuss how spontaneity, chance, and taking risks are all part of his creative process. Please give Michael Hafftka a very warm welcome.
Thanks, Lisa. It's beautiful to be here. Michael, thank you. Your presentation is awesome. It really touches on so many things that I think I'm going to lead into also as an artist. And it touches on the most important thing, which is that art changes us in a really deep way. And that's what we really all, I assume, look for in art. We want to be moved and we want to be changed. So the first thing, I'm going to go through a little bit of how I work and how I got to where I work and some misconceptions that people have about painters. I don't know that you necessarily have those misconceptions, but people very often think that I'm looking at something and then I'm rendering it, more or less like what a camera would do. A camera will do a perfect reproduction, and an artist does some reproduction with different variations. But that isn't something that I do. The other thing that people often think artists do is create a fantasy, create something abstract, or create something beautiful, or create something for your entertainment. And again, I don't think that's, I know that's not what I do, and I don't think that's what artists look to do when they're becoming artists, when they're starting out. And the reason for that is that I think we're always trying to engage with something really deep inside of us and find something that expresses our uniqueness. And after all, that's the first thing about us that I think that's the most important to acknowledge, is that we're all very, very unique, and that if we're going to make art on any level whatsoever, it has to arise from that. So I don't think of my work as perceiving. I think of it purely as feeling. And to illustrate that, because I'm a visual artist, people always think about visualization. So I don't visualize at all, and that's turned out to be a great thing. And what I mean by visualization, if all of you think about it right now, if you could think to yourself, can you see your mother? And then I think a lot of you can. And this is what we mean by visualization. I can't, and that puts me in a very unique position. So no matter what I think about my mother, I'm always going to come up with some sort of association, but I literally can't see her internally, and I can't see anything internally. So because of that, I have to invent things. And everything that I invent, I think, actually comes out of psychological necessity. And, you know, I think that the inability to actually see something internally and then apply a critical mind to it has helped me immensely, because essentially I'm lost before I start. So all criticism is actually kind of worthless, and it would just send me to your office. It would create tremendous anxiety. So how do I work? Essentially, the way I work is I just focus. And that's a very general word to say I just focus. But actually, the art of focusing is turning inward. And somehow, without looking outward, by just feeling myself, I'm in the presence of either the inspiration, which is this abstraction that's surrounding me, that's enveloping me, or a person in front of me. If I'm painting somebody, I'm actually just feeling that person. And through feeling, because visual language, again, it can't be translated into words, and feelings very often can't be correlated exactly with words. You know, it's very easy to say I feel bad, but what does that actually mean? You know, the actual bad feeling encompasses a lot more than, you know, the sandwich turned out to be miserable, or I mean, that's making it trite, but really our feelings are much deeper and way beyond words in general. So I think that being an artist, I try to just focus completely on feeling. That's not to say that I don't understand the other way of perceiving art. So when I go into a museum and I see a beautiful painting or I hear a great composition, you know, then I'm an art lover. And it's very easy when you look at a work of art and it's admirable and it's beautiful to love it, but that's not what making art is all about. And so I want to make sure that I express a little bit of that distinction, because very often people, when they find out they want to be artists, or they're becoming artists, or they're involved in art, they think it has something to do with loving art. And that's a kind of tourist view of art. And we all have that. We all listen to music, but creating music is very different than actually loving music or loving painting. So, you know, I think that in the end, you have to face a kind of unbelievable nothingness, a kind of, you know, search and for what I would call inspiration, but what I would say is, how do we touch that spot inside of us? And that spot inside of us isn't really a spot of ambiguity, it's actually knowledge. So, but you have to be willing to say, well, I know. So, and that's kind of a bold statement when you're talking about things that are completely vague and amorphous and just purely a feeling. But nevertheless, it is knowledge, and it comes down to, like, babies know things. You know, they're not taught something, but they actually know things. And there's a psychological term, we were talking about it right before we started, the unthought known. And it's a great concept. I think it really is what artists do. They get in touch with that real primal, essential feeling of knowledge and certainty, and they just run with that. So, you know, the next thing that I wanted to point out is, so essentially, I don't think of it as a craft. I don't, and we were talking earlier about not practicing, I don't think of it as something that requires virtuosity. I actually think of it as something that requires discovering the magnificent beauty that was never there before, that can't come through any other channel except your own uniqueness. So it's kind of like a religion, it's kind of like a spiritual practice. And what I mean by that is actually, it's not a religion with dogma. We all share this religion. It doesn't exclude anybody. But the reason I call it a kind of spiritual practice in a religion is it requires the one thing that all religions require, and that is devotion. And so even in the moment, even if we do only one piece in our entire life, that piece will only succeed if actually we're bringing to it such immense devotion that we actually get to this phenomenal point where we actually recognize the complete transaction of love that making art is. And I know that sounds a little grandiose, calling it love, but really that's what it really is all about. Because the connection is so deep and so profound that there's no other way to look at it. And it becomes a kind of life and death experience, and which is what love essentially is. Even if we talk in terms of a baby, then love is kind of, you know, a whole thing of survival. So I'll tell a little bit about my background and why I got to some of these extreme positions in art. I'm a child of Holocaust survivors. And so being a child of Holocaust survivors, my first introduction to the world really is how horrible the world is and how unbelievably cruel the world can be. So my first, I think essentially the first thing that made me want to be an artist actually is a desire for freedom. And I very much relate to what you were talking about, improvisation, and towards hearing many voices and trying to, because there isn't just one voice ever in freedom, there's many voices in freedom. So my attraction to art was really completely to liberate myself, to experience freedom. And you know, as a child, I tried many different things. I tried drugs, I tried religion, I tried the idea of doing something altruistic and public service of some sort, you know, thinking in terms of this is the direction I would go in. But I found none of those things are actually satisfying, and none of those things are actually as exhilarating as creation is. And so my experience of creation was just tremendously feeling free. The power of creating something that came out of nothing had just an immense, overwhelming recognition of this was meant to be and to exist. So I think we should look at the first slide group. We have 4 of them, and let's look at the first group of slides if we could, which will show some of my work.
Sure, you were being spontaneous here. So
That's fine.
So I should choose 3 already.
Oh, really? Okay. So I didn't turn the clock on either. So okay, let's. So this is a painting from 1986. It's called When I Was Born. Can we turn the lights down? I think we'll see it better. Is that possible? Thanks. That's better. Thank you. Okay, let's keep going. It's a painting called Authority. In life, it's actually a little bigger than this. So is the other one, but just to give you some perspective. Dependent. Okay, you know, so when I was a little kid, let's leave it on this, on memory, because this is something I wanted to talk about. When I was a little kid, I had this nightmare And it was a really powerful experience. I'd wake up sweating and really horribly terrified. It was a reoccurring nightmare. And what it was, and I have no idea, again, this has to do with the unthought known, I have no idea how I even had this concept, but I was on a rail car. You know those cars, it's a train car where you pump. And I was going at the speed of light in every direction possible, and it was an incredibly frightening, terrifying, overwhelming experience, and I knew the end result would be that I would be obliterated. And so I would always wake up, of course, before I was obliterated, and I'd wake up absolutely, completely terrified. And I was a little kid, I didn't tell my parents, and anyway, what would my parents say about this thing? But it was really so real and so overwhelming. And I had it many, many times, and I used to dread going to sleep. And at some point, and I don't know how, I realized that, you know, I was sick and tired of being yanked by this chain. And going to sleep, I said to myself, I'm not going to wake up. I am going to go with this feeling. I'm going to go with this train car, and I'm going to see what the hell happens after being obliterated. And I'm just going to go all the way. And the amazing thing, and so I was in my dream and I was doing this, the absolute amazing thing, it turned into absolutely intense pleasure. I mean, overwhelming, phenomenal, orgasmic pleasure. I was a little kid, I hadn't taken any drugs yet, and this was phenomenal. It was just absolutely, totally exciting. And I lived for it. I wanted to recreate this experience every night. And it actually became hard to do, which sent me in many directions in life. That's a whole other thing. Wait, I'm looking for a quote that actually relates to that experience of the nightmare. I have it here somewhere, yeah. Because years later, actually, years later I was reading a book by Joseph Campbell. It was called Suktavati, A Place of Bliss. And so there was a line in there called A Mythic Journey, and it related to this experience that I had as a child. And I'm going to read you the quote, because when I read this, I recognized that this was the beginning of my artistic process. We're in a free fall into the future. We don't know where we're going. Things are changing so fast. And always, when you're going through a long tunnel, anxiety comes along. And all you have to do to transform your hell into paradise is to turn your fall into a voluntary act. It's a very interesting shift of perspective, and that's all it is. Joyful participation in the sorrows, and everything changes. And that's exactly what happened to me as a kid. And I realized as a little kid that desire to transform this crazy experience into something utterly positive was just that, was just switching and taking a risk. Of course, you know, I could have said to myself, whoa, I can't go into that dream, I'm going to be obliterated, but instead, I guess I was desperate enough to just dive in. And I recognized years later that that's really, taking risks was really actually my artistic process. And I want to explain very quickly what I mean by taking risks. Whenever you start creating anything, you just naturally, and especially as you get older, you develop some skills, even if you don't intend to. And when you do develop these skills, naturally you do some good things, some bad things, and so you're faced with a painting and there's a lot good to it, but also it doesn't work. You know, it still isn't a complete painting, and that happens with creating music too. There's a lot good to it, and then there's a lot wrong with it. So how do you fix it? And the way to fix it is not really analytical. The way to fix it is actually take the risk of destruction, because we're in the act of creating. But actually, if you just allow yourself to destroy anything in it, and after all, we're talking about art, which is a wonderful thing. You can't hurt anybody when it's your own art. So I'm a big fan of destruction in creation. But I don't mean for that to be expanded into life or a political sentiment or anything like that. That's one of the great things about being an artist. You don't have to mess with any of that. So actually, risk-taking is a big part of it. And chance is a big part of it. And not knowing is a big part of it. And the main thing, I think, is to really actually be comfortable in that very, very difficult situation of not knowing. So let's, that was memory. So that was actually a painting that resulted thinking about that nightmare. And actually an interesting thing, this also has to do with psychology. I was speaking to a psychologist once who had a similar background to me. She was also a child of survivors. And she told me that many of her family members tried to escape the Nazis on handcars. And so her feeling was that I was actually painting a transgenerational memory. And I don't know, you know, I'm not a scientist, I'm an artist, so I don't know whether I would say factually this is a transgenerational memory, but I think it brings up a very interesting thing also about art. Things come from everywhere. And we synthesize all these voices, and you put it in musical terms, we synthesize all these different streams, and what comes is actually a kind of sanity, and the sanity is that it's very varied. And one of the, bringing myself back now, how I started actually, interestingly enough, I started really with dreams, and I thought I was going to become a poet, actually, I don't know why. But I thought I was going to become a poet, and I wrote these miserable derivative poems, and they were really terrible. And I could, even I could tell, and most often you can't judge your own work, but I could tell how I was copying poets I read and admired. And they were just absolutely terrible. But then I started dreaming so many dreams at such a rapid pace that I couldn't keep up with it. I just literally couldn't write these dreams down. There were so many dreams that I just started sketching them. And having no skill whatsoever and a complete inability to draw, then I couldn't fuck them up. I couldn't create pretense. The drawings were so utterly raw and so perfect, and they conveyed actually my feelings essentially. Because actually without words and by being totally straightforward, if we let the stream flow from us, we are authentic. And I just stumbled on that kind of experience from dreaming. And so that was my very, very beginning. And what it taught me was essentially to let go of criticism, to let go of analysis, to let go of all the things that stop you in the process of making art. And we'll see the rest after I'm going to read you. I'm going to read you one thing, a closing quote. It's by Martha Graham. I think it says it all. It really kind of expresses what we all should be looking at. There is a vitality, a life force, an energy, a quickening that is translated through you into action. And because there is only one of you in all of time, this expression is unique. And if you block it, it'll never exist through any other medium, and it'll be lost. The world will not have it. It is not your business to determine how good it is, or how valuable, nor how it compares with other expressions. It is your business to keep it yours clearly and directly, to keep the channel open. You do not even have to believe in yourself or your work. You have to keep yourself open and aware to the urges that motivate you. Just keep the channel open. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank
so
you.
much much. I'm looking forward to the Q&A because I have a lot of questions, and I think a lot of our audience members do as well, just from, there's so many connections between already the first two lectures, you know. Finally, hi Tereza. Our third and final presenter is Tereza Lee. Tereza Lee is a pianist and an immigrants' rights activist. Tereza and I have known each other for at least 20 years as a student at Manhattan School of Music. And during all this time, until very, very recently, I never knew this other life that she had as a passionate and history-making activist. I think it's very safe to call her a superwoman, being a pianist, a chamber musician. She is about to become Dr. Lee. She is getting her doctoral in music performance, and she has recently become a mother. Her third child has been born, and we should all fall on our knees and ask her, how do you do it, right? So tonight, Tereza will be sharing her experience of growing up undocumented and how her piano obsession ended up playing a role in her creation of the DREAM Act, a bill in Congress that would correct the status of undocumented children in America, and the start of a nationwide immigrants' rights movement. I'm very looking forward to hearing her presentation. Please give Tereza a very warm welcome. Woo!
Thank you, Lisa. And thanks for organizing this event. And to Yamaha Studios for opening up the space for these kinds of conversations. I think they're really important kinds of conversations that take place behind the scenes, music behind the scenes, other than just in the concert halls or conservatories. For someone like me, being a concert pianist was completely out of the question. Completely out of the question. I grew up in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Northside Chicago, and it was gang infested. My friends, classmates brought knives and drugs and guns to school, and they were proud of going to juvenile detention. On top of that, my family was undocumented. That meant that we had no government documentation, aside from, I have to include this, aside from the tax ID that the government issues the undocumented residents, so that we could continue to pay full annual taxes to the US government as undocumented residents. And we had no legal visas, green card citizenships. It meant that we were basically stripped of all rights as people. We didn't have the right to health care. We didn't have a right to a driver's license. We couldn't get a legal job. We couldn't go to college, especially at that time when there was no public knowledge or any support for undocumented Americans. It also meant that my family was unable to bring food to our tables, and we went to bed hungry sometimes. They were unable to provide decent shelter for us, and that meant we lived in a basement that flooded every time it rained. There were rats and mice crawling around. There was no heat or hot water in the middle of cold Chicago winters. And that was just how poor we were. We were desperately poor, and we couldn't help it. We were stuck here with nowhere else to go but to stay. Being undocumented also meant that we were always at the risk of deportation. For us, that meant that I would be deported to Brazil, where I was born, and my parents to South Korea, and my little brother, who was born in Chicago, a US-born citizen, would be put in some foster care in Chicago. And we lived in constant fear of this. We feared any authority, the police, the crossing guard, our teachers, the local librarians. And we had nightmares growing up of police storming up our stairs, breaking down our doors, and taking my family away. In fact, all of this affected my behavior development. I began to not talk to people. As soon as we stepped outside of our apartment, I became mute. Just in case the words, "I'm undocumented," just slipped out of my tongue. I became painfully shy and muted, and being undocumented also meant that we lived in isolation. And for many, this translates into severe depression and even PTSD. And this was our daily lives. It was day and night. And this, unfortunately, today continues to be the lives of 11 million people in our country. All because of an outdated system and the government that have failed to pass any DREAM Act or a comprehensive immigration reform bill for the last 19 years or so. So, how did someone like me get on the road to becoming a concert pianist? A career path that requires so much invested money and a lot of practice time. And I'll backtrack a little bit and start the story with my parents. I call my parents the original dreamers because they first had the dream to start a good life for their family and for us. My parents grew up in South Korea during the aftermath of the Korean War. My dad actually, he remembered growing up in Seoul, capital city, in 1950s, in shacks on dirt roads with US military tanks rolling by, passing out canned foods and Bibles. My parents lost everything, their families lost everything. They became one of thousands of migrants from Korea that made the big move to South America to start all over, not knowing if they will ever return. And I was born in Brazil. My parents actually did pretty well there. They opened up a clothing business until a relative stole my dad's checkbook, forged his signature, and emptied completely his bank account. So my mom had to sell her wedding ring, some jewelry, and with that money, they decided to buy plane tickets and visas to the United States to start all over, once again. At this time, I was 2 years old. As soon as they arrived in Chicago, my dad looked into getting a religious worker's visa, so he studied and became an ordained minister. But he was never quite able to grow his congregation enough to be eligible for a religious worker's visa. But he did have a wealthy parishioner who, when she found out how we were living without any furniture or beds, she bought us brand new furniture, including a beautiful black upright piano for me. So I was 7 years old at this time, and I fell in love with the piano. I played it every day. I played, 3-4 hours a day at 7. It gave me joy and a sense of purpose, and as well as respite from the harsher realities of life. I became my dad's church's full-time pianist by the age of 9. I had memorized the entire hymn book. I could read anything that was put in front of me. I became the accompanist for my school choir. I started winning some local competitions. When I was in high school, I got a full scholarship to the Merit School of Music. This was the first time I was able to get piano lessons, legitimate piano lessons. I had a few piano lessons growing up here and there, but they were so expensive. But this was the first time I had weekly lessons at the Merit School of Music, a full scholarship. And a year later after that, I won a bigger competition, which allowed me to perform Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. I was the first inner city kid in Chicago's history to win. I grew up in the Chicago public school system, and I attended the kindergarten to 8th grade on the north side of Chicago, and believe it or not, at that time we still pledged allegiance to the flag of the United States and sang the national anthem every morning before school began. I took part in many events through the school, did community service, I won a spelling bee, I won the science fair, I was a straight A student. I graduated from the 8th grade there and never missed a single day of school. And so the school awarded me with a savings bond for having perfect attendance from kindergarten to the 8th grade. I was so happy, excited to receive the savings bond, and I ran home and showed it to my dad, and he said, "Hey, you're undocumented. I'm sorry to tell you, but see, this is one of the things I didn't understand fully at such a young age, what it really meant to be undocumented, except for that my family could be taken away from me. It meant that I could not fully participate in the American system. I couldn't open a bank account, I didn't have a social security number, or any number. I couldn't cash the savings bond. It was a worthless award to me. My dad ripped it up and threw it away in the garbage. I learned the big lesson that day, that no matter how hard I studied and paid attention in school, no matter how many science fairs I won, I wasn't allowed to get into higher education. And as a kid, that can be very debilitating and even become ingrained in our minds for years to come as an adult. I'll tell one more story that made me understand what it truly meant to be undocumented. My family and I were walking out to our car after my high school Christmas concert, where I sang in the choir and played the piano. And we were crossing the street, and a car came speeding by and hit my little brother. And we saw my brother fly high into the sky and drop to the pavement. And we ran to him yelling and screaming because we thought he had died. The police came and the ambulance came, and next thing, we were standing in the waiting room of the ER with the driver, the woman who had hit him. She was speeding and talking on her cell phone, and she was completely at fault. And the police was there with us, ready to write the report. But my dad, he quickly told the police to write in his report that my son was at fault. He didn't look both ways while crossing the street. So the woman is free to go. So the woman thanked my dad profusely. She was in tears and she left. And the police was satisfied and he left. And we just stood there in disbelief. But what my dad had done was he did what he had to do in order to save my family, to keep us safe from being deported. If that woman or the police knew that we were undocumented, that could have been the end for us as a family. And this lesson taught me that I was literally, I really, really could not participate at all in the American system. So instead of looking into colleges like the rest of my high school friends were doing at that time, I buried myself into practicing the piano every chance I got. Many days I managed to practice 10 to 12 hours a day. I was completely obsessed. I read through everything that I could get my hands on because the piano was my escape from reality, from the horrors of my childhood, pains of being undocumented, being isolated. Music was literally how I survived. It was around this time that the Merit School of Music's late artistic director, Ann Monaco, called me into her office to ask which colleges I would be applying to. And I simply told her that I wasn't going to college and left it at that. And she responded, "That's ridiculous. Everybody goes to college." And so she just, without communicating with me at all, she just printed out and handed me 10 different college application forms, and she instructed me to have them filled out and brought them to her as soon as possible. And so I did. I brought them to her the next day. And she immediately noticed the social security number box that was empty. And I burst into tears and I begged her to please not turn me in to the police. Otherwise, my family could be taken away. And instead of reporting me, what she did was to begin looking into ways to help me that eventually led us to Senator Dick Durbin's office in Illinois, in Chicago. Senator Durbin looked into my case, but he returned with an answer that there was no solution, that I would have to be deported back to my birthplace, which was Brazil. And in fact, he said, even if I had found the cure for cancer, I would still have to be deported. We realized then that the very system that we were living in was outdated and unjust. So I began to gather letters of support from every source I knew, my teachers, donors, supporters of the music school, and presented them to Senator Durbin. Then he did something miraculous. He decided to write a personal bill for me, as that was really the only solution. It was to change the law. It was to update the law. I was ecstatic, overjoyed that I might actually be going to college, my status fixed, and be able to say, yes, I am indeed American, not just because I grew up here, but my paperwork says so too. Because that's one of the other things, you have a lot of identity issues. Am I Brazilian? Am I Korean? Am I American? What am I? And then other students that were also undocumented heard about this personal bill and started coming out to Senator Durbin and said, Senator Durbin, can you write a personal bill for me too? I'm also undocumented. And he realized that it wasn't just about me. There were other people like me. And we had no idea. Nobody knew in the year 2000 just how many undocumented people there were in this country. Because there were no surveys done. The first research came out in 2005 and in 2007, stating that there were millions of undocumented Americans. And today we know there are 11 million plus, counting. And Senator Durbin, he redrafted this bill. And the new draft became known as the DREAM Act. By 2001, I made it to the Manhattan School of Music in New York City on full scholarship. And on September 11th of that year, 2001, I was on my way to the airport to go to Washington, D.C. for a hearing on the DREAM Act. I was really excited because we had 62 votes lined up. That was a pass. It was ready to be passed. President Bush was ready to sign it into law, and DREAM Act was going to be a reality. But all the flights were canceled due to the terrorist attacks. In addition to the horror we all felt that day, what it meant for the DREAM Act was that a bill that was going to be easily and uncontroversially passed stalled for 19 years. The mood of the country changed that day on 9/11. The American public became more fearful, particularly of perceived outsiders. Any immigrant-friendly legislation was out of the question. Over the next few years, however, the undocumented youth, called Dreamers, began to organize. They were bravely coming out of the shadows to tell their stories. They were leading a national movement to record our stories and videos online, social media, and art form. They organized demonstrations, marches. They organized safe spaces for those that were undocumented to meet and support one another. And most importantly, in my opinion, they won public support. Last year's polls, if you remember, showed that a whopping 86% of Americans supports the DREAM Act. I took part in leading the movement in my own way, connecting with other undocumented youth across the country willing to organize. We practiced civil disobedience, did sit-ins in our politicians' offices. I even blocked Senator Schumer's building doors until he brought his entire Democratic caucus to vote yes on the DREAM Act. And yes, we got arrested. We came together to get Obama to issue DACA, which brought temporary relief to undocumented youth. We brought our parents to come out as well, to fight for themselves, to rally our friends and citizens to call on our representatives to pass comprehensive immigration reform. And during these Trump years, we also organized locally, creating our local underground railroad system and sanctuary systems for our undocumented neighbors. And we still have a lot of work to do, but I want to stress how important the youth are. In this case, the undocumented youth that were the seeds to growing an entire movement for immigration reform in this country. Thank you. I'll perform a piece for you that I played as a kid. It's by Chopin, Fantasy Impromptu.
It's just amazing how you can know someone for 2 decades and not know them, so much. Thank you so much, Tereza. Where is she? Yeah, yeah, for such a very, very moving presentation. So we're going to just very quickly set up the chairs, and we're going to start a Q&A session with our 3 presenters. And so this is how it's going to run. I will ask a couple of questions for each of the presenters, and then I'm going to open the floor to y'all, and I'll leave this microphone when the time comes. So Michael and 2 Michaels and Tereza. Thank you. Yes.
Just turn it on.
Very good.
Hi. Good to be here. Where should we sit?
It's equal. It's all the same,
Okay, so,
equally
yeah.
black and
Well, fortunate to be in the middle.
functional, yes. Isn't this beautiful? I'm so very happy just seeing all of you here tonight together. I've known each of you separately, but it somehow seems to make sense that you're all here together. There were so many overlapping topics, and you guys are our Instagram heroes for the next month, it seems. So I'll start off with Michael Alcee. Yes. I think one thing that an overarching theme that I had from all of your presentation was the attitude towards art and creation, and how it could be a combination of struggle and also need and release as well. And certainly you've worked with musicians who are trying to work with the struggles in their lives so that they could create. But at the same, and certainly, I mean, I know very well what that struggle is. It's complex and multidimensional and stifling and debilitating. But at the same time, there is this artistic sense that, you have to struggle in order to create good art and so forth. Where do you draw the line between struggle that is actually creative versus debilitating?
Yeah, there was a psychologist by the name of Rollo May, and he said that there was a very fine line between what was emergence and an emergency. And much of what is creative and interesting is on the borderline between emergence and emergency. And I think whether it's in our artistic work or even in our psychological work, is being able to become more open and interested and curious about that. And so that, you're right, what's the line between something that becomes too much and something that is useful? It really all depends on how it's played. Sort of pun intended, right? That really is the key determining factor. And again, it's also how is meaning made from it, which is, I'm also thinking about both the stories here too, is how is meaning made out of the complexities and challenges and struggles? How is our particular storyline connected to universal symbols, right? Because Carl Jung was brilliant about this, of talking about how we need to connect to the collective unconscious. And that the collective unconscious in dreams, in myths, in music, in every artistic form. In fact, all of the arts are basically an encyclopedia of the collective unconscious. And so it's ironic to me that sometimes that feels divorced from living a wonderful life.
And if any of you want to ever chip in a conversation, please go ahead. Michael, you were, I think, the quote by Joseph Campbell was very, very moving to me, and how if we could accept these struggles not as necessarily a bad thing, that it can actually be exhilarating as well. And also your comment about, I think all artists, musicians understand this power and the freedom that we feel in making music or creating something. And it reminded me of a quote from Stephen Sondheim's musical Sunday in the Park with George, where there's a very famous song called Finishing the Hat. And he says at one point, you know, look, there's a hat where there was never a hat, right? And that feeling of wonderment of creating this hat out of nothing. I was wondering if also when I was younger, I mean, I was thinking of being an artist as, you know, what's the point if I'm not the best and I'm not, you know, making a kind of some sort of name in the world and so forth. But as I get older, it's becoming more of, I'm doing this really for myself. And what is your attitude towards your art? Do you actually think of what place does this art, do my feelings have in the place of the world, or is this completely unimportant to you?
No, it's not unimportant at all. Actually, I related very much to what you talked about. And I think the commonality is not in my suffering as a child was nothing compared to what your childhood was like. And I was also a child of immigrants, and so I recognize that whole dynamic. But art saved me, and art clearly saved you. And I think that the notion that we have, and I tried to bring that up with the Martha Graham quote, of just being critical, of saying, oh, well, I'm not the best. Well, how do you even define any of that? It's meant to really actually save us, and it saves us from profound suffering. And suffering, you don't compare one suffering to another anyway. And so I feel that I was just incredibly lucky to discover a way inside. The way inside is also the way outside, and I think that's clearly what Jung was talking about in terms of the collective unconscious, you know, consciousness. It's outside of us and within us at the same time. So, you know, I just think we need to be saved.
Yeah, I think your story and Tereza's story is a very obvious example of how the arts kind of saved us from certain things, but I think for all of us, in one way or another, the arts, we need it to
Well, saving is not a trite thing. It doesn't mean I just feel good or she feels good in the face of sorrow. It actually heals us. And, you know, that's the power. The power is actually, it actually heals. Yeah.
Tereza, you were talking about identity.
That was clear in your playing, by the way. I mean, I really felt that overwhelmingly when you played. That was just, you know, phenomenal. I mean, feeling actually, for me, also just thinking about your experience playing that piece as a child and hearing it through that perspective. You know. Sorry. Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Tereza, you were mentioning identity, and of course you meant more national identity, but you have done so much in your life already, and as a musician, and as an activist, and as a woman, and as a mother, and so forth. When you lie down, what do you think makes you proudest?
I think the fact that I do my very best every day as a human being, at least I try my very best, with whatever is presented to me, because that's how I survived. I was undocumented, so I'm not going to have a second chance, is how I thought of it. And so I have to get it now. I have to do my best now. And that was the way I climbed up, I believe.
So you don't necessarily think of yourself as a pianist or this activist or American or all
So
these.
I do have those different lives that I carry, but as a person, I am the activist, I am the mother, I am the teacher, I am so-and-so, and I'm not necessarily American or Korean or Brazilian. I'm a person, and that's how I identify myself, and that's how I make an effort to treat other people as people.
I wanted to echo what you said. Walt Whitman, the great American poet, wrote a beautiful collection called Song of Myself. And one of the things that he said that I've always loved, kind of an answer to your question, is he said, do I contradict myself? Very well then. I'm large. I contain multitudes. And the point is that we all contain multitudes. And it's really hard to say what part we are because we contain them all. And there's no real separation. And I think that's sort of the interesting thing. And I think that's what artists do so well, is they connect disparate parts and are always ever curious to see how to vary those parts and to interestingly interconnect them in ways that you wouldn't expect. And some of that is through feeling, and some of that is through technique, and some of that is through a letting go to both of those, having this interesting chemical reaction that we can't quite understand. If that helps.
Yeah, for sure. As you've demonstrated in the fugue. So, yes, I'll just pass this around and this could be a musical night.
I just can't wait to jump up for questions. And thank you for all of you for such wonderful, interesting, open-hearted conversations, and really the bravery of it, of vulnerability of all of you. And also, I must say that Manhattan School of Music is like my favorite alma mater. I prefer like so much more than Curtis. Honestly. I'm talking about being honest. And because it has so many wonderful people that are so interesting and different and, you know, just full of like their own lives and personalities. And it's a pleasure for me to find out that, Michael, you are the counselor of MSN. And so I have a question to you, Michael. So I'm raised very classical pianist, and then I turned into contemporary pianist, and also tapped into activism more of, now I'm working on a program, anti-Trump program, but I worked with the NASA scientists for climate change and Power Up for the Intertribe. Nobody booked it yet. And I tap into a lot of art things, also playing multimedia things. And so, yeah, I definitely, and Tereza, you brought me to tears. And that's the thing. I as a musician, as an artist, I feel a lot. And I think I'm also an entrepreneur. I started a school in Shanghai 9 years ago. So I understand I'm pretty proud that I'm wearing lots of hats. And I think I've learned, I don't know how exactly intuitively or with studies of psychology and personal coaching, to navigate my feelings, my strong feelings in art and in music that I do. But I do realize that sometimes in personal lives, in daily lives, just because I feel so much, you know, I did an empath test, I'm like, 98%. And I was once working with a personal coach, and I said, well, is there something, I wonder if I'm bipolar, if I'm like really triggered by things, and I feel so much, and it's hard to switch the mood sometimes. And she said, well, but any great artist or like you should be this way, like and I'm imaginative and I can visualize things and intensely. So you must counsel lots of musicians who probably have stronger sensitivities in some ways, artists,
Yeah.
And what are your advice,
Oh, I love the question, and I think you're right on. I think artists happen to be very highly sensitive people, and I think we often forget that because of how competitive and difficult the artistic world can be in other ways, that many artists are very sensitive by nature. There's a lot of introverts as well within the artistic world. And I think it's really important to talk about how that impacts us. And understanding that it's hard to be able to be in touch with so much. That's why I said there's a wonderful poem by a Polish poet named Adam Zagajewski, and it's titled "Try to Praise the Mutilated World."
And the idea is like when you're sensitive, you're in touch with both the beauty and the grace and the pain and the sorrow, which is one of the reasons why I think music calls to us, because music has probably the most kind of complex vocabulary of human emotion possible. Even better than words, in a way. Even richer than words. Right, you know, there's that old saying that not only that the Eskimos have so many words for snow, because they know it in all of its different varieties. But as I quote Stephen Dunn as a poet who says, but there's not so many words in the English language for loneliness. And yet, if you listen to good music, you can find so many different words for loneliness and sorrow and ambivalence and joy and everything. And I think coming back to your question, it's really important to understand how to take care of that sensitive side. And also, one of the beautiful things about having a sensitive side is that we're always trying to figure out where we can put these things into form, right? Where we could put these different feelings, these different places. But it's also important to make sure that you take enough breaks. In terms of taking enough time to recharge by reading or walking in the woods or doing those things that get you out of being around all the energy. Which is why many artists do take time. One of the reasons Emily Dickinson was a reclusive poet was also because she felt the world so keenly. And so she said something beautiful. You know this poem, tell all the truth but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. Like lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. For people who are sensitive, the truth dazzles, and it must dazzle gradually.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So it's really important to nurture that, no matter what any teacher or producer or director or anybody tells you. And that's where I think learning how to take care of that side is taking care of this instrument. And that's the instrument that serves the other instrument.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, Lisa, so much for hosting this talk. I feel so exhilarated and emotional, and I haven't felt this way. Actually, I can't remember the last time I felt this way after listening to these great speakers. Thank you, Michael. I think you did an amazing job, especially as you were just seamlessly going from, very interesting talk and then piano and then back and then back forth. And all of you, honestly, Tereza, I got to this point where I wanted to cry so much, but it was like beyond crying. And as an immigrant myself, I cannot relate to your experience, but I'm so glad that I heard it. So I wanted to ask you, when you hit the absolute rock bottom, what made you what was that? What was it that brought you back up when you felt like, I want to give up, this is it?
Well, thank you. When I was in high school, after my brother's car accident, that was my rock bottom. We had lost everything and we were in so much debt, and paying the hospital bills was over a decade of struggle for us. And so once we hit that rock bottom, we had nowhere else to go but to go up. It's what rock bottom is. And so really, like I said, I buried myself in practicing the piano and trying to be the best at it. And it really paid off. In less than 2 years, I was 16 when I started taking lessons. And in 2 years, I got into Manhattan School of Music on full scholarship.
Wow.
And it really paid off. And that's how I dealt with my rock bottom at that time. after the Dream Act first failed in 2001, after 9/11, I hit another rock bottom because, well, one, 9/11 happened and the Dream Act was never reintroduced until years later. And my mentor, Ann Monaco, the artistic director who helped me through this process, she was killed in a car accident, hit by a drunk driver. And she was like a mother to me. And that was another rock bottom for me. I didn't know what to do with myself. I was undocumented and I was lost. And then I started acting out in school. I lost my scholarship at the Manhattan School. I begged them for them to give it back, and they gave a little bit. And I didn't know what to do. I actually bought a $5 Portuguese book to learn Portuguese and to deport myself because I didn't know what else to do here. Then, to answer the question, I'm getting to the answer, is that I met the love of my life. He, which I did not expect at all, and love has a way of bringing you back to life and making things brighter in your everyday life. And I gotta say, love is what's actually saved me from that rock bottom. Yeah.
Let's pass it back.
Rock bottom. Reminds me of a blues song that says that I was so far down I had to look up to see down. And that reminds me of all three of your presentations. I have an uncle, a great uncle, who was born 3 months before Louis Armstrong, and he became one of the unknown figures in the history of jazz. He was one of the handful of people who introduced jazz to Europe in the 1920s. He lived to be 90 years old. We're just finishing up a book on him, which is going to be published in January. But all of your stories make me think of my uncle Arthur. Arthur Briggs was his name. And for so many reasons. Tomorrow night at this very moment, I'll be sitting in front of McCoy Tyner at Jazz at Lincoln Center, listening to him play for the umpteenth time in my life. He's now 80 years old. I never get tired of McCoy Tyner. And you mentioned him tonight and demonstrated a little something that he might have done. The interesting thing about this whole thing to me is that, of course, clinical psychology is a human construct. There's nothing natural about it necessarily, but it can be used to unravel things, as you so eloquently described. It can be used to help us understand things. Music is not necessarily a human construct, although structured music, what we can say is. But you know, the term the blues, for some people means melancholy. Other people it means a note less than a half tone away from another on the diatonic scale. And it was colored in blue because Europeans didn't understand how Africans were singing these weird notes, the bending notes, and singing notes in between the half tones. But in reality, they were singing based upon the sounds of nature, because music predates the human construct of jazz or classical music. I say all that because so many different things here. My uncle, when he was in Europe, he happened to be in Paris. He spent most of his life in Paris. Came from Grenada in the Caribbean, came to Harlem, and then went across to Europe. And he was in Europe, in Paris, when the Nazis invaded and occupied France. He spent 3 years in a detention center, which made me think about your having survived the Holocaust, because he told many stories about being in a detention center where he was allowed to play classical music he had to play only classical music for the Nazis. but he could play jazz for the other detainees. The Nazis themselves didn't want to hear any jazz, they only wanted to hear some classical music. He was an excellent trumpeter, and so his story is, the book is going to tell his whole story. It's going to be out in January, as I said. But when you talk about rock bottom, he talked to me about being at rock bottom when he was in that detention center for 3 years. 3 years. Now, he wasn't in line for, death. At least he hadn't been told that. And he did survive that whole experience. But it's still, you didn't know what was going to happen from day to day. You just didn't know. You knew you weren't in a line to go into a chamber, but you weren't aware of what was going to happen to you. And that's, all of these stories struck me. Someone here who's a survivor of Holocaust folks, you're talking about the integration of using psychology to understand the improvisation of jazz and so on. And Tereza, your story, my Lord, this should be on national television. People need to understand how this whole thing got going. They need to hear your story. This is an extraordinary night. Anyway, I don't want to go on too much longer. One of the questions I don't even know what, I have so many questions for all of you. But I'm just thankful to Lisa for bringing this program together. It's incredible. And I've forgotten my questions. If I think of them, I'll talk to you.
I want to thank all the presenters for presenting, and also to Dr. Yui for having this event. This was a really wonderful experience. So my question is for all the presenters, but it was kind of going through my mind when Tereza was talking. I can relate a lot to your experiences because I also grew up undocumented, and it was like all the things that you were saying, like my mother also had to sell all her wedding jewelry and things like that to come to the country, and it was just like this constant fear of being deported. And for us, it was just like we weren't allowed to tell anybody, and my parents didn't even tell like their closest friends. And we were just never allowed to talk about it, not just for the fear of being deported and for like safety reasons, but there was just so much shame and stigma attached to it. So like we did so many things actively to show like the opposite. And that's one of the reasons why the piano was introduced, because it's like, the piano was a symbol of something very elite. So it's like showing that, this wasn't going on, and it was more of the external. So my question to you is, when you were starting to become vocal and becoming this activist in the spotlight for the DREAM Act, were you fearful of the repercussions of being open about being undocumented? Because I'm not undocumented anymore, but I realized like my experiences growing up made me still fearful today to talk about it. I mean, even though I can't be, it's like still kind of, even my parents, they have their citizenship now, but we still all carry this mentality that it's still a very scary and fragile situation. And then I started thinking about also the fearlessness involved in what Michael and Dr. Alcee were talking about too. It's like you have to overcome a certain fear to be spontaneous, right, in art making, and also in seeking counseling and seeing a psychologist. I started seeing a psychologist at the happiest time of my life. It's like
Good now.
right. And I think that you have to also overcome a certain fear. And I come from a culture where you don't talk about your family, you don't talk about these kinds of things, you don't talk about growing up in poverty and things like that. So then it's like I waited until everything was really great in my life, and then I started seeing a psychologist. So I'm wondering also, how does a person get over this fear of appearing perfect, or this one-dimensional way, as you were saying, and exploring all these multiple selves, bringing that voice in that you were talking about, that, is afraid to be heard, right? Like the voice that's very, very loud, and the voice that's really quiet, the voice that doesn't want to say anything.
Right.
So,
You could
Yeah,
start.
thank you. First of all, thanks for talking about your undocumented experience.
you inspired me. Yeah, I was like, wow, that's wow.
Yeah, like I said, if we don't share our stories, people don't know. Harvey Milk, the gay rights activist, he said, if you don't tell your neighbors and friends, that they will never know. So we have to, this is why I share my story. Regarding overcoming that fear, I think like Michael, you were saying, letting go of the analysis, letting go of all these things that block us from making good art. It applies to life as well. I at a certain point, like you said, like your family, our family, we never talked about it. We never discussed it. We discussed it one time. That was the most important discussion ever in our lives, and then we never discussed it. We never discussed it outside of our families. It was shameful as well, not just that we feared deportation and family separation, but also we didn't want our church friends or our school friends, anyone knowing, because they might look at us like, oh, you're not one of us, or you're not part of the gang anymore. And so, and especially in Korean culture or Asian cultures, a lot of people, activists, actually undocumented youth that come out onto the streets and share the stories are actually Latinx, not Asian. More Asians are starting to come out to share the stories and realizing that we need to start sharing this, because actually the Asian immigrant group is the larger coming in group in United States. And so for me, at a certain point, when I came out to Amnako, the artistic director of Mayor School of Music, I realized that, wow, that was so difficult for me to do, number one, but such a relief to have told somebody outside of my home. And then she proceeded to try to do everything to help me. And we got to Senator Dick Durbin writing a bill for me. And I realized, wow, we need to speak out about the stuff in order for things to change, for laws to change, for whatever to change. And that's when I realized that I can just let go of the fact that now everybody knows that I'm undocumented. And I started doing speaking events, telling my story, sharing my story, and that was extremely difficult for me to do, because of the fact that I had become shy and muted, and I had to practice speaking again in front of a camera, and it got better, but yeah, and I think that's my answer, is I finally decided to let go.
I just want to make sure everyone, because I know some of you in the back have been trying to ask questions, or was that my imagination? Okay.
So I just want to say.
I just want to add one thing before we move on. Just a quick little tidbit for what you had to say, because I think it'll answer your question a bit. One of the things about being undocumented, my father was a refugee. He was from Egypt, and with Europeans and Jews he was kicked out, he was stateless. He was essentially undocumented. And so I feel like the son of a refugee, and why Tom Petty's song, "You Don't Have to Live Like a Refugee," always plays in my head. And when you go through that experience, you're traumatized. And trauma protects us by helping us to dissociate, but it also persecutes us. And so, there's this Jungian analyst named Donald Kalschit, and he says, what trauma does is a diabolical process. And what diabolical means is not that it's just devilish, is that it throws us apart, it tears us apart. And what's the opposite of diabolical? Symbolic. So it's no surprise that many people who experience trauma look to art to help them symbolically put together the pieces and to find safe havens to bring together back this that which cannot be spoken and that which needs to be witnessed. The other thing is that we need to do that primarily through a relationship, which is why therapy is so effective, but also why teachers are so effective in helping us to open up and have access to that which cannot be named.
Or lovers.
Or lovers. As we've noted too, that the relationship itself is what opens us up. So in other words, when we're talking about this, we're talking about exile from the self. And in other words, many of us are undocumented, figuratively speaking, as well, even if we're not literally undocumented. And that's why we should have a sense of justice and compassion about that issue, because who amongst us doesn't feel that way? And the other thing I just wanted to add is that how do you do this? How do you overcome fear? And I just wanted to recognize that the word courage actually comes from the French word cœur, which means heart. Because it's the center. It's what pumps to everything. And Ralomé said it is the center for all the virtues known to us. And so it takes a great degree of courage, but also a great degree of heart in order to do this. And I hope that answered your question.
I want to add to that because what Dr. Alcee was talking about, for example, for me, actually, I think the piano practicing helped me to understand how to let go. Somehow practicing and playing the music, because piano was my voice. I didn't have a voice, piano was my voice. And through the piano, I was able to express whatever emotions, feelings, moods, thoughts I had. And I think that helped me to understand how to gain courage.
Yeah, that, to me, that's exactly it. Art, as I said before, saved me. And it's, I don't like to use the word practice because it's not the same in painting. But the discovery that you go through by just unfolding and diving deeper or just going forward, that's actually what develops you, gives you your voice. And the art is the voice. And so, it's an extraordinary thing. That's why I ended again with that quote by Martha Graham. And we're all very, very unique. We shouldn't really be judging it. We should just be doing it.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, so just a quick comment and then a question for all four of you. So first, I just want to say thank you for speaking today, and the comment that you said, Tereza, about like all the different actions that are that undocumented communities taking is so true. So some context. I met Tereza last year when I was traveling the country to document the stories of different undocumented activists. And so throughout my journey, I met people who are doing the things that Tereza said, activists, artists in Salt Lake City painting murals all across the city to highlight their stories. People doing like incredible like bicycle marathons from like Seattle all the way down to the border to like spread the news about that. Non-DACA recipients coming out of the shadows and sharing their story as well. It was really inspiring, and even people within the like ally community going to extremes to like raise funding to like create scholarships for the undocumented community, students, and things like that. So we're making progress and we're winning. So my question for all four of you guys is, okay, so I'm a student in Michigan, and I'm a resident assistant at the freshman dorms. And as the school year is finishing up, I've seen a lot of my residents, kind of grow, develop, and kind of get to know them more. And I've seen some of them kind of go through hardships, some struggles, some not visible, others visible. So if what could be some advice, some wisdom that I could bring from all you guys about pursuing your passions, about developing and growing, and just, and just persevering through times of difficulty. Like in just quick advices that I could pass on to my residents who, final advice as a year ends.
I guess I've been nominated because I work in college counseling. This is a broad question, like what is the meaning of life? But I appreciate it. The question is, what do I tell people in terms of, what do you tell people in terms of dealing with their passion? Yeah, I think it's a combination of both being curious and compassionate with understanding what kind of instrument you actually are, and then learning how to play it, metaphorically speaking. In other words, if you're a viola, play it, and play it beautifully, but don't expect to be a trumpet. So many of us try to force ourselves to be things that we are not meant to be. And only you can really understand what your full nature is. And I think that's what everybody here is sort of illustrating, that each of us has a different, unique voice. And yet it's this wonderful amalgam of all our experiences, our personality, our nature. And so I think one thing is to get to know yourself deeply. That the greatest education you can have in college, in addition to the books and everything else, is to know yourself. And that takes patience, it takes courage, and it takes what poet Rilke said, you have to learn how to embrace the questions themselves. That would be my answer.
Thank you.
It's really just like the Nike ad. Just do it. So, and the reason I say that is because finding out who you are, and that's a wonderful thing, it just doesn't happen unless you're doing something, or in love, or following your passion. So you might not know where to go, and you might not know what instrument you are, but just by doing it, you'll find out. If you are a trumpet, stop plucking strings. You'll figure that all out. But I really absolutely have to insist the only way in is by just going forward and doing it. And that's also the only way to overcome fear. With regard to our conversation about fear and being a documented and undocumented immigrant, my parents also were refugees, they were documented. But they lived with tremendous shame. I relate to this. They had tremendous shame from where they came from. Tremendous shame from being a slave, from just doing nothing but working and eating. So, when you grow up in any situation where your predominant environment is fear and shame, actually, you have to heal that and break out from that. And art's a really wonderful way. And I can't stress that enough.
Hey, Danny. I think for the undocumented community, I've known so many of my friends that are undocumented. They wake up every morning and think, I'm still undocumented, I'm depressed, what am I going to do with my life? Every morning they wake up and this is how they think. And that it's like I was discussing earlier, is that kind of fear is all pervasive. It's that depression is it's constantly there, and somehow I was able to break out of that and say, hey, I may be undocumented, but I'm still alive, I'm still thinking, I'm a human being, I'm able to do things, I have the power to do things. I myself have the power to play piano, to practice 10 hours if I want to, if I can do this. And in 2 years I did it, and I got into Manhattan School of Music. And I think the power is within ourselves. And yeah.
I don't feel qualified to speak among these right now, but I have been, my whole life has been practicing and talking about piano and practicing the piano. And there was a point when I had serious anxiety issues. And I was always trying to find out ways to get rid of it until I reached a point when I had an injury where I really seriously wondered if I could ever play again. And when I healed from that, it was replaced with such feeling of gratitude for being able to play, that I realized that to get rid of anxiety and pain, it wasn't to fight against it, but to replace it with gratitude and the sense of fun, and how wonderful it is that we can do this, what a privilege it is. And in fact, and this is a beautiful way to close the evening, I have been speaking about music and I've been playing music for all my life. And when I was thinking of doing something at Yamaha, because I love this space so much, I was thinking, okay, I'll play, I'll invite people to play, I'll talk about piano, and I thought, I've been doing this for over 20 years. This is so boring to me, right? It's not that I don't love the piano, but I thought, I want to hear, I have so many amazing friends, and I want to hear them talk about their life and how the arts actually affect the world and how it actually changes the world, not just how to play this phrase beautifully, you know, when was Schumann born? And I have to say that this idea I had was not to change the world, but because I thought that would be really fun, right? To hear these people talk, and it would be moving. And I'm just so happy that this evening actually happened, and I'm so grateful to all of you for making this evening happen, and I'm absolutely grateful to you for coming tonight. And thank you very much. You to please, if you have glasses, it would be enormously helpful